Welcome to those that are joining this webinar. We'll just wait for a couple of moments until everybody's managed to get access. So just a couple of minutes and we'll start the presentation. All right, everybody. Well, firstly, good evening and welcome to this second of 3 webinars of some very significant planning changes on the way for Waipā. So we can have the next slide, please. My name is Wayne Allen and I am the Council's Group Manager of District Growth and Regulatory Services. Tonight, we're aiming to do 2 things. First, give you an overview of some really complex changes that have been really forced upon us, changes that we think have the potential to fundamentally change parts of Cambridge, Te Awamutu and Kiki's residential areas. And secondly, and most importantly, we want to answer any questions as possible about those changes that you may have. I'll talk a bit about that in a minute, but I did want to cover off some housekeeping matters first. Everybody apart from the presenters on tonight's webinar will be muted, otherwise it's simply impossible to hear people. Please be aware that tonight's webinar is being recorded and a link will go into our website tomorrow. And questions you submit in the chat during the webinar are not private. The first webinar that we've conducted is already on the website, so that is able to be viewed. In terms of questions, we've been encouraging people to send in questions early, and we've received some questions tonight early, and during tonight's webinar you'll also be welcome to ask more and use the chat function that's provided to pop your questions in there. So let's go to the next slide. But before we start, I did want to reiterate a couple of things. There is lots of information about this issue already on our website, including a whole series of questions and answers that we're continually adding to. So please take a note of the web address above and jump in if you haven't already and have a good look around. So that web address, as you can see, www.waipādc.govt.nz/plan change 26. Secondly, have you received the brochure information that was sent out in the mail? But if you haven't, go to the website, it's on there, grab a copy from the council office as well, it's available. That has our frequently asked questions in there relating to this plan change. We've tried to use easy read language for everybody to understand. Thirdly, take a note of this email. If it's districtplan@waipādc.govt.nz that you've got, the key email address. If at the end of this webinar you have more questions, send them here and they will be picked up by the team. And speaking of the team, let's go to the next slide. We've got 4 people on hand tonight, including myself, to help answer questions. Tony Quickfall, our Manager of District Plan and Growth, who is right across all the complex legal and technical and process issues. Joe Cook-Monroe, who has really had the difficult job of writing the proposed plan change 26. So Joe knows this plan change fairly well. And Tony Coots, who's our Principal Engineer of Growth, he has a really good handle on the infrastructural issues. So he'll be able to answer any questions that you may have in relation to the impacts on our infrastructure as a result of this plan change. Behind the scenes, we also have some people collating the questions and making sure the webinar runs smoothly. We've allowed about an hour for this webinar, but can be flexible. So let's get into it. Next slide, please. So this slide is about change, and change is coming. So there are new laws that are forcing changes to the Waipā District Plan. That's the Resource Management, Enabling Housing and Supply and Other Matters Amendment Act 2021. It came into effect at the end of last year. It requires all Tier 1 growth councils to notify a plan change by August this year. We have done that. We've met that legal test. Our plan change responds to that legislation. It's called Plan Change 26, Residential Zone Intensification. These new laws aim to address the national housing crisis and apply to big growth cities such as Auckland, Christchurch, Wellington, Hamilton, Rotorua, Tauranga, plus some smaller towns. And Waipā is caught up in these law changes, specifically the residential zones in Cambridge, Kiki, and Te Awamutu. Other parts of the district are not affected. So I want to be clear that it doesn't impact directly on the rural zone, our large lot zones, generally those that don't have wastewater connections, industrial and commercial areas, our town belts, our reserve areas. The Karapiro residential zone is not affected because it didn't meet the threshold of a 5,000 population requirement under the legislation. The other important point I just want to say right from the outset, in terms of this plan change, none of the new medium density residential standards will have legal effect once the plan change has been notified, and we've already notified the plan change. This is because all of the new medium density residential zones in Cambridge, Kiki and Te Awamutu are proposed to have a qualifying matter overlay on them. I'll talk a little bit more about qualifying matters shortly. So, at the time of the plan change notification, nothing will change in terms of what is a permitted activity. The current district plan provisions will continue to apply. So those that want to build 3 houses on a site at three stories will be required to get a resource consent. They will not be permitted activities. Next slide, please. So in practical terms, there is a national housing shortage. The changes aim to see more houses built faster in high growth areas. Central government wants landowners to be able to build 3 houses up to 3 stories high to a maximum height of 11 metres without the need for a resource consent. I'll just pause there and just reflect on what the legislation provides in terms of the bulk and location requirements compared to what our current Waipā District Plan provides. If you look at road setbacks, our plan would vary between 3 metres to 7.5 metre minimums. The new legislation would require a 1.5 metre front yard setback. Our side yards and rear yards currently in our district plan would vary between 2 metres to 5 metre minimums. The new legislation would require it to be 1 metre minimum. The site coverage in the legislation is 50% maximum, where ours was only 40%. Impermeable surfaces, the 60% maximum. Our plan is 60%, but in Cambridge North area, It's much tighter at 40%. Sorry, 45%. In minimum lot sizes or shape, there are no provisions, no minimum provisions or sizes in the legislation. In our Waipā District Plan, there are minimums that apply. Height, as I said, the new legislation allows you to go up to 11 metres, whereas ours would, in the district plan, would generally be around 9 metres that you'd expect. The new legislation would require a much more permissive height in relation to boundary requirements of a 60-degree recession plane at 4 metres above ground level, whereas ours would be more at 45 degrees north or 28 degrees to the south, depending on your boundaries, with a 2.7 metre above boundary. There are other provisions there, but I won't go into any further details. But suffice to say, the new legislation is a lot more flexible than our current district plan. So going back to the slide, as I said earlier, there's no minimum sizes for residential subdivisions in the legislation within certain conditions. It's essentially meaning bigger, higher houses closer to boundaries. Importantly, building standards must still be met, so there won't be any substandard housing constructed. The Building Act requirements are still apply. And the last point there, we put that in just to highlight that councils are unable to require on-site car parks, excluding accessible parking for any development, including residential. This was a government mandate in 2020. So these car parking controls have already been removed from the district plan. It was a requirement under the National Policy Statement, Urban Development. Next slide, please. So I talked a little bit earlier about qualifying matters. This is more a new Resource Management Act technical language being used in the legislation. So qualifying matters are matters which allow for modifications to the new planning rules. The legislation does not allow for an area to be excluded from the medium density residential standards. So that is why we have actually created a new Section 2A medium density residential zone across Te Awamutu, Cambridge and Kiki. Councils can add qualifying matters, but there must be very robust justification. In essence, the new planning rules will apply unless there's a very specific and robust reason for them not to. And that's where we think Waipā has sufficient reasons to not apply the medium density residential standards in our residential zones through these qualifying matters. Let's look at the qualifying matters, the relevant qualifying matters now. Next slide. As discussed, we legally have to notify a plan change to recognise the new legislation, and we've done so. We recognise Te Tura Whamana o Te Awa Waikato, the vision and strategy for the Waikato River, as a qualifying matter. Without the right infrastructure, particularly for stormwater and wastewater, an increase in housing has the potential to adversely affect the Waikato River and other water bodies in the Waikato catchment. We also acknowledge that Waipā's current infrastructure, its roads and pipes, does not have the capacity to cope with a huge and fast increase in housing. And we're talking the 3 houses per site. We believe Waipā should only have 2 houses, not 3 on each site, as a permitted activity. That is under our current district plan provisions. The legislation does provide for us to take financial contributions from developers as the primary tool to fund unplanned infrastructure. And we have updated the plan change to reflect that. However, this has added a further complication, as we normally take development contributions under the Local Government Act for developments. Financial contributions are imposed under the Resource Management Act. Any contributions applied on development will now need to have regard to both financial contribution mechanisms. Next slide, please. Other issues. Historic heritage and character are both qualifying matters. Retention of existing character clusters and character streets are to be maintained. It is proposed to add new houses into character clusters, and I'll talk about that shortly. No changes have been proposed to heritage items under the plan change. Protected tree, heritage and cultural sites designations and the national grid already in the Waipā District Plan remain protected in existing qualifying matters. Significant natural areas, cultural landscapes, e.g. the Waikato River, and public open spaces remain protected. Next slide, please. Other changes. An additional 91 houses have been identified as character houses and will be added into new or existing character cluster areas. We have sent separate letters to those landowners. Essentially, for those houses, a restricted discretionary resource consent will be required to make changes to the character. These are not heritage listed buildings. And I'd urge those landowners, if they have concerns about that, to lodge a submission on the plan change. As discussed, we've made amendments to the existing financial contributions in the district plan. Financial contributions will now be able to be charged in respect of residential amenities, street trees, and on a per bedroom or per dwelling basis in terms of the impact on the Waikato River. Next slide, please. The changes we anticipate. We may not see wholesale intensification fast, but we will see changes to our towns if the medium residential standards are applied. Property owners may add on granny flats or tiny homes without needing resource consents if they meet all the standards. These are commonly referred to as the second house on the site. Developers may seek comprehensive multi-storey townhouse developments. Developers will be expected to pay for infrastructure upgrades, but we do not expect this to cover the entire cost. The intensification changes are expected to drive costs for ratepayers. Next slide, please. So we've changed the slide from the previous webinar, and it just steps the process out a little bit more clearer. So submissions that seek to amend or delete the new density standards will be considered out of scope. This is not usual practice. You can lodge submissions on the qualifying matters. So we've notified the plan change as the first step there. The second step is the submission period. So we're in the submission period now from the 19th of August through to the 30th of September. Submissions will be considered by independent hearing commissioners, most likely mid-2023. Around May, June, they'll be hearing the substantive matters on the submissions. If Council agrees with the recommendations, it notifies the decisions. The next step, if Council disagrees with recommendations, it can present an alternative. But the Minister for the Environment makes the final decision, and there is no right of appeal on the final decision for this process under the legislation. New rules will come into effect from the date of decisions, and we generally expect that may well be maybe late 2023 or early 2024. And as I indicated earlier, that's probably the likely milestone point when things can have legal effect, given the plan change we have notified and the qualifying matters. Next slide, please. So how to make a submission? Submissions can be made at www.waipādc.govt.nz/have your say. Now, I've been advised that we're getting some submissions that are coming through by way of email. They've got to be on the Form 5 to be valid. So please, if you're making a submission, can you make it by way of the formal form? Also point out that government has funded a free independent friend of submitter service to provide advice on the submission process. The friend of submitter cannot write the submissions for you, but can advise on the process. If you need assistance on the submission process, please contact the friend of the submitter. And the phone number there, 027 315 0177, and email pc26@kineticenvironmental.co.nz. Submissions close 5 p.m. Friday, the 30th September 2022. And next slide. And that's the presentation, folks. What we will do now is just go into questions that people may have. We've got a couple of questions that have been submitted to us already, so we can go through that as coming up on the screen. Otherwise, please type your questions in and they'll come up on my screen. I'll read them out and I'll allocate them to people to respond to. So now's the time, folks. If you've got questions, just write them into the chat box and we'll do our best to respond to them. The first question there, and I'll just read that out. So New Zealand Herald published an article on whether we should follow the German housing model, whereby corporations own swathes of homes they rent out to people for a lifetime. Do corporations have the ability to replicate the German housing model? If the corporations never sell, young people will be barred from achieving the dream we once had of home ownership. And has the central government been transparent with this issue? Can this be a qualifying matter? So Tony Q, I've got a couple of Tonys online, so I'll call it Tony Q, and he's given this one a little bit of thought initially. So Tony, can you give us your response on this? Thanks.
Well, thanks, Wayne. Good evening, everyone. I'll take these questions in reverse order because it's probably easier to answer that way. So the first answer to the last question, can this be a qualifying matter, is no. So in the short answer, there are no qualifying matters that relate to occupancy type of housing. And under the current legislation, local government has no control over the types of occupancy, so that's entirely left to the free market. The second question from the bottom there, has central government been transparent? Well, I guess they've been silent, is probably the way to answer that. And what we've seen across the country is probably a maturing of New Zealand housing markets. So we're seeing new types of housing, more new types of housing than we have seen in the past. And that relates to the third question, the top one, around the German housing model. So that's, there's two components of that. So one is the build to rent developments, and you've seen some of those come up and down the country. There's been a bit of media coverage on build to rent. And so that's where you do get corporates who are building usually apartment type units with the express purpose of renting them out in perpetuity. That's kind of always happened in New Zealand, but we're just seeing more of it now. One good example, if you want to Google it, there's many of them around. But if you just go and have a look at Williams Corporation, that's their business model up and down the country. The second part of that question is we're seeing a different type of ownership in New Zealand that we haven't seen before, which is long-term leases. So a lot of the rental market until now has been short-term, week by week, month by month, maybe year by year. We're getting a couple of examples now. There's one in Queenstown, and there is actually one in Waipā of 100-year leases or longer. And so the one in Waipā, again, if you want to have a Google search of this, it's called Bridge Housing Trust. That's relatively new, and they have one development on Peak Road that's under development now, so that will be up and running. That's the first one in the Waikato. It's quite exciting, really. What they're offering there is really long-term leases, 100 years or longer, and there's different ownership models depending on the levels of affordability. So they're long-term leasehold, and one of the options that they offer is you only pay for a ground rent on the land. So you don't own the land, you own the building effectively, buy the building, and then you rent the land. So that's a model in Queenstown Lakes District Council are using. It's new for New Zealand, but it's an alternative form of ownership, and it's intergenerational. It's not uncommon overseas. And in fact, what you get overseas is you get different generations passing the lease between generations. So we have no controls over that, is the short answer, but it's a new type of housing. Thanks.
Oh, thanks, Tony. That's a really comprehensive answer, and thanks for that response. The next question was about, can we ban sausage houses in your proposed plan change like Auckland City Council has done? And we've managed to find a photo that looks like sausage houses, so looks a bit scary. But I asked Joe to think about this question and respond. So Joe, could you respond to this point? Thanks.
Not thinking sausage houses look very attractive, to be honest. If someone decided to build this type of house under the MDRS in an area with no qualifying matters, they would be able to do that. We have not specifically thought about banning this type of housing. It looks like it probably could be, but the plan change does not provide us to ban sausage housing, unfortunately.
Joe, could you perhaps expand on that? Because does the legislation provide us to ban sausage housing?
Okay, so the amendment to the Resource Management Act does not provide for any local authority who's a tier 1 and has to do the medium density residential standards to ban sausage housing. As long as developers or people building these houses meet the medium density residential standards, they are entitled as a right to build this type of housing. It is but that is in areas where the standards apply outright and there's no qualifying matters over them. So if there's a qualifying matter over them, we potentially have a little bit more control over things like bulk, density, height.
Okay. Yep. No, thanks for that. So our existing plan provisions apply, and if people want to do things in terms of 1 metre from the side yards or 3 stories high, they will need a resource consent, and these matters can be considered at the current point in time. All right, then the next, we've got a couple of more questions. I'm gonna need my glasses on these ones to read. So the question was, how can we find out if a specific area falls into the areas demarcated for these changes? I would like to know if St Kilda is protected by current covenants or whether we expect these changes. I've seen the map at the Wilson Street offices, but it's quite small and I'm not sure of the answer. Joe, you might be able to help me out, but I'll give it a quick stab. there that it does apply to all our residential areas in Cambridge, including St Kilda, Te Awamutu and Kiki, and current covenants remain dominant, and therefore the plan change will not override the covenant requirements. Have I got that right, Joe?
Yes, perfect.
Right. I think I answered all of that part of that question. Yeah. The next point, probably another one for you, Joe, is about parking. In terms of not having to provide parking, if houses are on a roundabout, like a corner of Thornton Road and Robertson Street in Cambridge, are there exemptions to still have to provide parking because there's simply nowhere to provide safe off-street parking?
The issue of car parking is not within the scope of this plan change. Under the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, we cannot require developers to provide car parks. Some developers may offer up car parks, and if they did, we would accept those graciously, but we cannot make developments provide car parks, unfortunately. So you'll be seeing a lot more cars parked on the roads, or as currently happening around where I live, people are parking on the grass berms.
Okay, if you can stay there, Joe, for the next question, a little bit more detailed. So this one's talks about under map 56 qualifying matters. Cambridge, as proposed by plan change 26, there are 3 qualifying matters currently identified. That's the river, gully proximity, stormwater constraints, and infrastructure constraints. This blanket overlay looks to be a very heavy-handed approach that at worst smacks of NIMBYism, or using it as a ploy to make delivery of affordable housing even more difficult to achieve.
Okay.
Rural planned intensification lends itself to areas situated within close proximity, walking distance to services, not on the outskirts of a town, city. Discuss.
Okay, first I will take the issue of affordable housing. The medium density residential standards are not about affordable housing. Plan change 26 is not about affordable housing. The plan change and the medium density residential standards are about intensification in our residential zones in Cambridge, Kiki and Te Awamutu. The standards aim to increase housing supply. An increase in housing supply does not necessarily mean we get more affordable homes, unfortunately. In respect of the overlays shown on map 56, those areas were mapped out based on detailed modelling that occurred for stormwater, water and wastewater. The red area, which covers the centre of Cambridge, basically means even if we brought projects forward that have been scheduled for the next 10, 20, 30 years, the infrastructure is not able to cope with any additional demand being placed on it. The orange areas show, again, if we brought projects forward, there could be some areas that could cope, there could not, there may be other areas that may not cope, but at this stage, it is not, there is no certainty that the infrastructure would cope. So we have not, I do not believe we've gone heavy-handed. We have done our homework. We went out for independent reviews and assessments, and then we mapped the results. In future, there's nothing to say that the orange areas shown on those maps may be reduced, but that would come after more modelling is done, after the application of the plan change, and council having time to see how the financial contributions are going to work to help fund further infrastructure or residential amenity in the areas that are intensifying.
Right, thank you for that, Joe. Yeah, look, I'd say no. Look, what we're saying here is it requires a resource consent process. It's just not a permitted activity. So we require considerations on the impact on our infrastructure. But before I leave this question, I'd just like, if I could, Tony Q to come in and just talk a little bit about the issue about affordable housing and what we're looking to do in the future on affordable housing, because I don't want to leave that issue hanging by way that we're not doing anything in this space and what our plans are in regard to this. So Tony, could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, thanks, Wayne. So Joe's exactly right. So this Plan Change 26 in the government legislation, it's not about affordable housing, but behind it, Minhud have the theory that increased supply will reduce prices. It's way more complex than that. And the financial analysts are taking a very simplistic approach, in my view, and in the view of a number of practitioners, I guess, who are involved in this, in that increased supply does not automatically equal reduced affordability. So that's the first point to make. We do have another plan change that we've got to roll out next year, probably, just because of our capacity and priorities at the moment. That's called Plan Change 21. There is some information on that on the website. It needs a bit more scoping up, but one of the scopes of Plan Change 21 is to look at how we can enable more affordable housing in the Waipā context. So I'd already talked earlier about the Bridge Housing Trust. That's one example where there's an affordable option that's been provided by a trust. There are a couple of other tools that we can bring out. Queenstown Lakes District Council is just about to notify a plan change using financial contributions to take a contribution of money and apply that for affordable housing. So we've got a number of possible mechanisms. They're a little bit untried in this country, but they're very common overseas. So inclusionary zoning, where, for example, in greenfields or large-scale brownfields, we might take a percent, or there might be a percentage of those housing, which is typically 5-10%, that are required by law to be affordable. We don't have that in this country, and we've been asking central government to help us, but that's fallen on deaf ears. In Australia, in the UK, and I believe in the US, that's common. If you're developing and you're at scale, 5-10% must by law be affordable. So yeah, hopefully that helps. We do have a bit of a plan for looking at that next year, once we've got this one out of the way. Thanks.
Thanks for that, TQ. And I don't want to also leave the issue of impacts on infrastructure without TC, who I think might have some comments around that as well. So is there anything you want to comment on in that question there, TC?
I think it's just probably important to look at the word that it's been saying, it's heavy-handed approach and blanket overlay. So that blanket overlay isn't something that council has necessarily demanded. That's been the demand of this plan change. So in terms of our infrastructure assessments and those modelings, it does need to be conservative because it is a blanket overlay. The statement around well-planned intensification lends itself to areas situated within close proximity to walking distance and services. We couldn't agree more, but that's not what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with a blanket overlay that covers a wide range of areas. And to do so, that's why the infrastructure constraints overlays are so heavy-handed. So what this plan change does compared to our current Waipā 2050, it doubles the density range of those areas. And that, of course, through that planning that we've had in our forward planning for those dwellings in 2050, the system is completely different to that.
Thanks for that, TC. The next question we have is, do you already require every dwelling to be constructed to provide car parks? It's my understanding that car parking is already not a requirement to construct a dwelling. Yeah, that's correct. We do not require car parking on site for any development because the government has mandated that to be the case, except for accessible car parking requirements. I've got that right, team, unless there's a dissenting view. I think that's the way it is. Is there any other questions? Casey, is there anything else out there? that was the end of my questions that I had that people have raised, unless there's still some coming through. Yes, there's some more questions. I can't see any more. Hang on. Does Waipā DC population modelling support the need for massively increased housing demand and the changes? Does any of the members of the team want to have a go at that question?
Yeah, I can probably have a go at that. So we're part of what's called a future-proof growth collective. So that's really the high growth councils of the Waikato region. So it's us, Hamilton City, Waikato District, and Matapiako District. The Waikato Regional Council's on there as well, also Minhud, and the Waikato, the Regional Council's on there. So they do quite a lot of modelling around housing capacity. And in fact, under the National Policy Statement for Urban Development, we have to do that by law. We have to do forward capacity modelling. And what that shows actually is that we have supply for the short, medium, and long-term future as it's defined in that National Policy Statement. So, in fact, in Waipā, while the government has directed us to intensify across all residential zones, our research has shown us that in terms of supply, there is forward supply. And what we've got in Waipā, there's a bit of foresight that was given. So we've got some greenfields which are coming on stream. Not all of those are developed. So we do actually have quite a bit of capacity that's still got to come on stream.
Thanks for that, TQ. The next question, if the council are against housing intensification in Waipā, why has it allowed this to happen in various subdivisions around Cambridge? Joe, do you want to have a go at this one?
Happy to have a go at this one. We are not against housing intensification, but it needs to be appropriate and planned intensification. The medium density residential standards have the ability to basically triple a population in a certain area where infrastructure has not been upgraded. There's no access to green spaces or parks, potentially no space to park a car. It's all about having planned development, planned intensification. And as a council, every year we do an annual plan which sets out what projects we are focusing on for the next year. And then once every 3 years, we do a long-term plan which sets out the projects we are doing for the next 10 years. And what these new standards have done is brought around an unplanned for intensification of housing, and people want livable homes. They want nice places to live. People come to Waipā because of our rural environment and our access to green spaces and having nice places to live, walk, work. And we felt it was important that these are retained so people living here have nice places to live. It's not about development at all costs or intensification at all costs. You still have to have a livable town or city or village for people to live and for people to want to come and live in, rather than just having the sausage homes that you saw on the slides that Wayne presented.
Yeah, the other point I'd just reinforce what Joe was saying, it's been done through a resource consent process. So if it has happened, it's generally through a resource consent process, not permitted activity. So the neighbours wouldn't know about things happening because the hammer starts next, banging away on the property adjoining, generally through a resource consent process for significant intensification. The neighbours are advised and they get involved with that process one way or the other. And they're generally in identified areas that we already have for medium residential development. So yeah, the point there is that we are not against intensification. It has to be in the right locations, not happening right across our residential areas. Right, next question. Does the council feel Waipā has been singled out because of our stance on three waters? I saw at a recent council meeting that it could cost millions to upgrade infrastructure to enable these large buildings. Do you think the government are trying to frighten us? TC, that's probably a question right up your alley.
Yeah, I'd probably say it's the opposite in regards to singling us out. I just feel that there hasn't been enough thought process in regards to speaking with the individual councils to really apply these things. There hasn't really been engagement with the central government to really outline our concerns on this. And half of that is because I believe they are just trying to get everything through the process. In terms of the Three Waters reform as well, they are looking at those growth aspirations at the point in time and seeing how council's current funding regimes would fund the growth in infrastructure. But it's still early in the piece with regards to this plan into MPS, as that's not really covered in this. So I would say it's not a lack of individualism against one council. I'd say it's a lack of pulling every council together to get that same blanket.
Thanks, TC. The next question, will we lose any of the current green space that we enjoy around Cambridge, as we know Cambridge today? And is there an intention to keep the rural ambience of Cambridge? So I guess the first point about our reserve areas, our town built in Cambridge, no, there's no impact from this plan change or this legislation on those green areas in terms of the town built or our reserves. So you're not going to see any buildings built in that green space under this piece of legislation. So those green areas remain protected, and importantly too. And is there intention to keep the rural ambience of Cambridge? Well, we think so. We provide for a variety of different types of land use activities, the more intensive residential and general residential, our large lot developments that you see south of Leamington, in the rural areas beyond. So this piece of legislation does not impact on, as I said earlier, the rural zone or our large lot areas. It only applies to our residential areas in Te Awamutu, Cambridge and Kiki. Right, the next question. Developers aren't going to build developments if there isn't going to be the demand for them, and added demand would have to come from a growing population. If your own modelling says that expected population growth falls within the expected current growth expectations, why do you think there will suddenly be a surge in population growth to drive the demand for new developments? TQ, this might be another population sort of question. Do you want to have a go at that one?
Yeah, I understand the question. So, and exactly right. So I guess the way I'd answer that is there's probably, under the new plan change rules, there's probably an emerging new type of developers. So what we typically see is, I guess, the professional developers who that's their business model is to do developments. That's what they do for a living. Then there's, I suppose, the mums and dads who might have a bit of a bigger section and want to do an occasional subdivision. So that's what we've got at the moment. One of the things that this new legislation creates is a free-for-all. So it creates the opportunity, if for example, we didn't have the infrastructure constraints and we were in a position where we were going to be permitting 3x3 everywhere across the whole zone, we did have modelling that would create about another 6,300 dwellings. Doesn't mean the demand's there, but what we would get is, because it's permitted, people can then, they don't actually have to subdivide either, and that's a key piece of legislation. You can put a new house on without a resource consent, without a subdivision consent. All you need is building consent. And so I guess that's the fear that a lot of councils have, is the free-for-all in an unconstrained market and the results that has on the urban fabric. So poor designed infill, which isn't fit for purpose, where if only all that is required is a building consent, we've got no way of sort of managing that. So it's really quite fortunate in the Waipā, I think, that we do have these overlays, because it means that we have a lot more control over the look and feel of the development that happens. But it is a really good question. It doesn't mean the demand is going to suddenly be there if the supply is enabled.
Thanks for that. And the next question, if any of the team off the top of their heads can talk about what the maximum expected population over the, say, the next 2 to 5, 10 years. So I guess, TC, you've done a bit of work in relation to what the population projections might be under the current environment versus the medium density residential standards. Do you want to have a stab at that one?
I'd have to crunch the numbers specifically there, Wayne, to get it to a 2-year and 5. All I can really say is that we, in our growth cells at least, we do have expected HCUs and how many we would be gathering up in those areas. So it would require some number crunching just to really work out a 2 to 5 to 10 years. It's also important to note with that sort of population projection is that we are working through our spatial planning aspect, which is our Ahuaki group, who are looking at the 5 different sort of scenarios that may play out in the future. And that's also helping to steer where council believe those population projections will be. So there might be a stab in the dark through some standard number crunching, but that's through one scenario lens. And we'll have to take into account this MPS as well for another sort of number crunch.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Unless there's any other sort of contributions, we'll get some information on the website relating to that question. And thanks very much. It's a good question. And we will pop something on the website about that, that response, hopefully tomorrow. That's the questions that we have. Unless there's any other final questions, I'll wrap up the presentation. So anything else? Casey, nothing else coming through? Nope. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for attending the webinar tonight. I know it's time out of your evening, and I really do appreciate it. The information is on our website. There's a whole lot of information there, including how to lodge a submission, and the webinars will be put on the website as well. So if you need any help, as I said in the presentation, there's a Friends of Submitter service to utilise, and if you need questions answered, there's opportunities to use the addresses that I've indicated. Okay, so I'll call it a wrap, and thanks very much for attending, and thanks for the team in being available to respond to the questions. Good evening, everybody.